Thank you for joining us today. My name is Natalia Martin, and I'll be your moderator for this webinar. Today, we have an important topic, which obviously served a lot of attention. We've got high record registrations. We're going to talk about evolving global OT cyber guidelines. Our panelist, Andrew Ginter, for those of you who don't know him, he's a VP of Industrial Security here at Waterfall, and he'll share his perspective on recent developments and evolution in general of OT security standards. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Please submit your questions in the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen at any time during the session. We'll try to answer all of your questions, but in case we're out of time, which happens sometime, we'll make sure to reach out to you individually via email and answer it via email. If you have any questions about our solutions in general and would like to speak to one of our experts, I'm going to share the link in the chat box for your convenience, so you can contact us directly. And with that, Andrew, the mic is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us. I'm going to go through standards. I'm going to look at some old. I'm going to look at some new. I'm going to look at the sort of the most important ones and the ones that are, driving and reflecting evolution. So let's blast on through this. I have a lot of material. I'm going to try and fly high and fast. I'm going to touch on 10 standards. So let's introduce them first, say a few words about them and where they fit in the ecosystem, where you use each of these, and then we'll look at trends, and I'll finish with some predictions. And I'm going to hit these in roughly chronological order, sort of the order in which they were initially published. The ISA, the IEC, ISA SP99 working group tends to create the 62443 standards. They hand them over to the International Electrotechnical Commission to publish the standards. These are arguably the world's most detailed, most widely used, most comprehensive industrial cybersecurity standards. They are, and now some of these are, some of these documents, there's a lot of documents here. Some of the documents are guidance. Some of the documents, many of the documents are standards. What's the difference? Guidance says, here's a bunch of stuff you can do. Standards use language like, you must do this if you wish to comply with the standard. You should do that. You may do something else. So the language is stricter in a standard. The standards, if you want to get the latest version, they do cost. If you want to buy one of each, it adds up. It's like $100 plus each. You can get them. You can get access to most of these, and some of these are still in progress. Not all of these have been published yet. It's a long process. It's a consensus-based process. But the ones that have been published, you can get access to many of them included in the ISA membership. So if you become a member of the International Society for Automation, you can get access to a lot of these. It depends on the copyright. Is the copyright started with the ISA and handed off to the IEC, or did the IEC, I don't know, revise a version of the standard on their own and publish it, and they own the copyright? It depends, but you can get access to a lot of these with an ISA membership. Some things to remember about these standards are yes, the most widely used, the most widely cited, but they can be a little confusing. They apply horizontally. They apply equally to small bakeries and large power plants or passenger rail switching systems. They apply equally across the board. And so we need to be very careful when using these standards to use, to interpret them correctly, to interpret them for our needs. If we're securing, if we do the minimum, the bare minimum that the entire standard, requires, we say there, we are 62443 compliant. What are we? We're passenger rail switching systems. What's the worst case consequence? Seconds after compromise, we risk, high-speed passenger trains colliding, mass casualty events. And you've done the minimum that 62443 requires. Yes, you realize that minimum is what you use for small bakeries. Oh, so we need to apply the standard carefully. We need to interpret the standard. We also need to be aware, and this is not unique to the ISA or to the 62443. It's true of all of the standards I'm going to talk about. Every one of these standards and guidance is a point in time. Some of the documents, the one I use the most frequently is the 62443-3-3, which talks about the security controls, long passwords, antivirus, things you have to do to make your system more secure. That standard was published in 2013. It's 10 years old. It's 11 years old now. The world has changed in those 11 years. And so when we use this standard, when we use any standard, we must be aware of the latest developments in the threat environments. We probably need to, look at the standard and say, if it says the minimum you need for, a medium-sized power plant is X, doesn't matter which standard it is, we should probably do a little more than X because the world has changed since the standard came out. I don't care if it came out last year or 10 years ago. The world is changing, so we need to interpret these standards. Another confusing aspect is how to interpret them. The 3-2 standard says how to do a risk assessment. One of the goals of a risk assessment, one of the goals is to assign a security level target to each of our systems, to each of our networks. How secure do we need to be? There's 4 levels of security in the standard. Do we secure the system at the minimum security level 1 or the maximum security level 4? 3-2 has that outcome of the assessment process as one of its goals, and no hint as to what criteria that you use to decide which security level to do. The section that says you have to assign security levels says choose a methodology and apply the methodology. What methodology? The standard doesn't say. So there are, because it can apply to anything, because, well, when it was written 10 years ago, there was little consensus in the industry as to how much is enough, how much security, how much engineering, how much of anything is enough. Nothing was documented. So we need to interpret these standards carefully to make effective use of them. So let's move on. And which came out first, NERC-CIP or the ISA? Oh, and I wanted to say a word about where these come from. The ISA started as a North American organization, the Instrument Society of America, and rebranded to International Society for Automation many years ago. They have members all over the world. Anyone can volunteer to help with these standards. It is an international effort. NERC is the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, tasked with assuring the reliability of the North American electric grid. It's mostly U.S. FERC has the legal authority that is delegated to NERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. In Canada, the provinces, each of the provinces have authority, but they have agreements with FERC and with NERC to use the NERC standards throughout North America. There's even bits of Mexico that are involved, but it's primarily, in my understanding, a U.S. and a Canadian exercise. These things are called standards, but really they're regulations. If we break the rule, the organization that breaks the rule is subject to a maximum fine, in the very worst case, of $1 million per day of non-compliance. So this is something that businesses in the electric sector pay a lot of attention to. The maximum fine that's ever been levied is $10 million. But if we're out of compliance for 6 months and don't notice, the maximum that could be leveled is $180 million, $1 million per day. This, NERC-CIP has a lot of documents. Most of these documents are mostly boilerplate. how do you provide evidence of compliance? What are the penalties? How do you interpret the penalties if there's no, the actual advice in there tends to be only a handful of pages per document. So they're not that hard to read. Something to bear in mind, though, is that this is not a complete security program. It looks complete. It has all of the elements of the NIST cybersecurity framework in it that I'm going to talk about in a moment. It's not complete because legally, FERC is allowed, and rather NERC is delegated by FERC. Legally, NERC is allowed to manage the reliability of the power grid, not safety. If we have, let's say, a small power plant that is, I'm sorry, irrelevant to the reliability of the bulk electric system, or only marginally relevant, we're going to be tasked, we're going to be, classified by NERC as a low impact site. NERC has 3 impact levels: low, medium, and high. Low impact sites have very few rules they have to follow, but they might still have boilers. They might still have safety critical systems. They might still have safety instrumented systems. The 2 or 3 or 7 rules that low impact systems have to follow are not, in my mind, sufficient to protect safety critical operations. Why does NERC say nothing about safety? Because legally they're not allowed to. So you need to understand, when you interpret these regulations, they are for the reliability of the grid, not for safe operations, not for protecting the financial interests of electric utilities. You generally need more than this in an electric utility to have all of your risks covered. I mentioned the NIST cybersecurity framework. Let's say a few words about it. This is not a standard. It's a framework. What's a framework? What's the difference? A framework is like a checklist saying, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? And this says, have you thought about network segmentation? Have you thought about controlling identity? Have you thought about rule-based, needs-based access? It's a checklist, but what it does a really good job of, and this was, it's done by the U.S. National Institute of Standards and Technology, but they took input from all over the world when they did this. But technically, it's a U.S. standard, or rather a U.S. document. The 6 pillars of NIST describe a complete security program, and so a lot of people, if you're designing a new standard or a new regulation somewhere in some country, a lot of nations, a lot of organizations look to this and say, have I covered all the bases? Did I miss anything? A lot of owners and operators look to the NIST cybersecurity framework to ask the question, have I missed anything? So it's a great tool for sort of making sure we've covered the bases. We have at least something everywhere. Do we have enough is not something that the framework answers. It does not say how much is enough. NIST, for the record, has lots of other documents on risk assessments and whatnot. But answering the question, how much is enough, is something I'm going to talk about a little bit later on. It's a harder question than the cybersecurity framework tackles. The framework, one other thing, when OT people read the framework, it makes sense. It sort of speaks mostly to the concerns of securing physical operations. When IT people read it, it makes sense. It speaks to them to the need to protect information assets. When military people read it, it makes sense. This was written by had a lot of input from a lot of people. The problem with it is that if an IT person reads it, there's no hint of OT in it. If an OT person reads it, there's no hint of IT in it. It sort of speaks to the language speaks to everyone's existing preconceptions. If an engineering team reads it and says, yeah, this says a lot of good stuff about what we need to do for securing our operations. And then they talk to IT, who says, yes, we agree. And then they talk to each other about what they're going to do. They disagree, because each of them has sort of seen their own reflection in the document. You cannot use this document to train someone else about what you think they should be doing. It doesn't work that way. So that's something that's a little bit confusing. Something came out in 2018 is the Singaporean Cybersecurity Code of Practice. Cybersecurity in Singapore, it's a small country, but it's surprisingly advanced. I recommend the Singaporean documents. Code of Practice for Critical Information Infrastructure. What is critical information infrastructure? It is, in my understanding, everything from banking to the automation that controls power plants. That makes it a little bit confusing, but a lot of the language in here is specific to OT. It says OT in every third directive, on average. And so it is less confusing for an IT person to read this and say, oh, that applies to OT, not to IT. For an OT person to read it and say, oh, that applies to everyone, including IT. So it's a lovely read. It is surprisingly readable. I mean, there's a bunch of boilerplate that I find confusing. I'm not a lawyer trying to figure out which businesses are in scope, which are critical, which are not, what's the law. But once you get into what you have to do, it's very clear. It's very nice. It's based on the NIST CSF. And so it covers all the bases. And it's focused on critical infrastructure. So it's not saying the minimum that a small bakery has to do. It says society expects stuff that's critical to the nation to behave this way. And it even talks about safety. So, I do recommend the document. Let's move on. TSA came out with a bunch of security directives. These sort of date to the Colonial incident in 2021. Came out initially for pipelines and later on for rail systems. Security directives are emergency directives. Regulations, if you have to follow them and you fail to follow them, there are penalties. And they have to be renewed annually. Now, the TSA has just issued a NOPR, a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, for permanent regulations for both sort of rationalizing what you see for pipelines and rail systems and different kinds of rail systems. The NOPR is not yet law. It's complicated. I would recommend for now, if you want, just read the security directives. They're sort of an easier read than the NOPR, which has a lot of legal terminology in it. Does not apply to all pipelines. The NOPR is going to apply to something like 2/3 of the nation's pipelines. I could be wrong. Dozens and dozens of pipelines. A lot of pipelines are in scope. There are some interesting bits in here. Stuff that I've never seen in any other document. So again, I recommend it as sort of an example of forward thinking. The document says, when there's an IT incident that cripples, or sorry, when there's a security incident that cripples IT, you are required to keep OT going, to keep the pipeline, to keep the rail system operating at the capacity the society needs, despite IT being crippled. Now, to me, that's always been the goal for all cybersecurity programs, for OT systems. But this is the first time I've heard it stated. So that's a little surprising. A requirement is that, look, if IT is crippled, you are required to separate IT and OT to the extent that it's no longer possible for the attack to jump from the IT network to the OT network. Most people assume this means an air gap. You're required to isolate so that you can check that the OT system is clean, and if it's clean, bring it back up and bring the critical infrastructure back into use. That's a requirement I've never seen anywhere else before, so something to think about. In particular, they said, look, if you do that and you're going to start up OT while IT is still crippled with ransomware or whatnot, then you'd better not have any dependencies from the OT system on the IT system. You better understand your dependencies, or you're going to have trouble starting back up. So these are sort of all interesting, forward-looking concepts that I recommend a read of the directives. NIST 2 is the big news in Europe. NIST 2 is not a standard. It's not a regulation. It is a directive. It's an order to the member nations to each create their own regulations for critical industrial infrastructures. The original NIST directive was the same thing, but the problem with NIST is that it was a little bit vague, and there was enormous variation across the union as to what kind of regulations came up. So the new NIST 2 says no, and it's much more specific about how, which critical infrastructures need to follow these rules, and which, what the characteristics, how to design a regulation. But again, every nation is producing its own regulation. Two concepts I'm going to come back to later on. NIST 2 demands that the regulations be risk-based, that they again demand stricter security for more consequential sites than less consequential sites, and standards-based. Ideally, the regulation does not have to make up its own stuff. It can refer to existing other internationally recognized standards. So this is the big news in Europe. It's confusing. It's behind schedule. A lot of nations, we're supposed to have this stuff, have the regulations published and law by, I don't know, October or something of this year, and they're late. It looks like a lot of nations are going to be, 8-9 months late getting these regulations out. Cyber-informed engineering is something new in the world. It is not a standard. It is guidance. What is it? It's put out by the, it's funded by the U.S. Department of Energy. It is being executed. The research contract is being executed by Idaho National Laboratory. It is receiving widespread interest from all over the world, but technically it's a U.S. Initiative. It positions OT security as a coin with two sides. One side of the coin is cybersecurity. Teach engineering teams about cyber threats. Teach them about the cyber risks. Teach them about cybersecurity mitigations and the limitations of those mitigations. The other side of the coin is engineering. What does that mean? If your life depends on a boiler not exploding in a large power plant, you're the technician responsible for the boiler. You work 8 hours a day within the kill radius of a worst-case boiler explosion. How would you prefer to be protected from a cyber attack that overheats the furnace under the boiler? Would you prefer a mechanical valve, where if the steam pressure is too great, it forces a piece of steel against a spring, the spring deforms, the steam escapes, there's no explosion? Or would you prefer a longer password on the PLC controlling the furnace? Most of us would prefer the mechanical valve. But here's the thing. Where is the overpressure valve in ISO 27001, the cybersecurity standard everyone uses for IT? Not a mention of it. Where is it in the NIST cybersecurity framework? Not a hint of it. Where is it in the industrial 62443 cybersecurity standards? Not a word of it. This is not the overpressure relief valve is not a cybersecurity mitigation. It's an engineering tool for managing physical risk, the risk of an earthquake, crimping the output piping on the boiler and overpressurizing the boiler. It's an engineering tool that's unhackable. There's so basically cyber-informed engineering is the big umbrella. Consequence, so don't get CIE confused with CCE. Consequence-driven cyber-informed engineering sounds a lot like cyber-informed engineering, but CCE, consequence-driven cyber-informed engineering, is a very specific trademarked set of knowledge and tools, most of which have to do with risk assessment and system of systems analysis and sort of deep cybersecurity. CIE is the big umbrella. Idaho National Laboratory is assembling a body of knowledge, taking relevant parts from safety engineering, overpressure relief valves, and protection engineering, automation engineering, network engineering, and of course, all of cybersecurity. The NIST cybersecurity framework: govern, identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. The whole thing. CIE is the big umbrella. And it's, again, widespread interest. The engineering piece of it, the engineering piece of the coin, has been neglected in the past. These are opportunities to use engineering tools to dramatically improve our resistance to cyber threats without using the most expensive parts of cybersecurity. So again, the first sort of big deliverable that's out is the CIE implementation guide. It's called an implementation guide. It's not a recipe. It's not first you do this, then you do that. It's more of a checklist. It is a list of questions that engineers should ask in the design of a system. Questions about engineering and cybersecurity both. There's an Irish standard out, 9 pages long, 4 of which are boilerplate, 3 pages of introduction and a page of references. There's 5 pages of meat in this standard. It's not even a standard, sorry, it's guidance. And the 5 pages cover all the bases. It's a beautiful standard. It's a really easy read. And all of the 5 pages of recommendations make sense to someone who knows a little bit about cybersecurity. They don't explain things in 1-syllable words. They assume you know what some of the words mean, and they just blast on through. So it's a great way to get started if you're starting from zero. If you want to get started in the field, have a look at this. Where are we? Oh, and I did want to say about the Irish, it covers most of the NIST cybersecurity framework. It's a little bit weak on the detect pillar, but in a sense, that's not surprising. When we design a security program, our first step is generally not quick, deploy an intrusion detection system. That's our second or third or fourth step. And so, this is a lovely document for getting started because it talks about the first steps very clearly. This document is something that came out of a sort of a consensus process of a combination of US and New Zealand and Canadian authorities. It is talking about remote access. It's talking about, it says network access security, but really they're talking about remote access. It is the leading edge of advice on remote access. It talks about the very latest kinds of tools to be available. It says, you're probably using some old stuff, VPNs, and, it says, get some of the newer stuff. It's a lot of focus on IT, but it does have one really good section on high-end, high-consequence, OT remote access for high-consequence systems. OT remote access for high-consequence systems when IT-grade remote access, is probably insufficient. And this is the last document. It came out very recently. It's a consensus of a ridiculous number of nations and agencies. And it's only a piece of the puzzle. It is a very readable document. It's not a standard, it's guidance. It talks about principles of OT cybersecurity, sort of guiding principles. It is, in my understanding, the first volume of a 6 or 7 volume thing that these organizations are working on. So I very much look forward to the future. It has a lot of very modern concepts in it. It, starts by talking about safety. Safety is paramount, right? ISO 27001 doesn't talk about safety. 62443 kind of talks about it, but kind of muddies the water with confidentiality, integrity, availability, sort of old school thinking about cybersecurity. It's a very modern approach here, modern terminology, modern perspective. Says, knowledge of the business is crucial. Your OT data sometimes is very valuable and needs to be protected, but physical operations need to be protected as well. And, talks about sort of the big picture. And again, I look forward to sort of follow-ons in the months ahead. So those were the 10 sort of big picture I wanted to touch on. Let's look at trends. What are we seeing sort of in common? What are we seeing evolving in these, some of them older, some of them newer, some of them being refreshed, standards, regulations, and guidance. The first one I want to call out is a term called hygiene, basic system hygiene. What does this mean? Well, where to begin? This is not a trend. This is reality. Most of the advice out there talks about basic hygiene. Why? I'm going to name names. I asked Marty Edwards once. This was a number of years ago when he was still the director of the US ICS CERT before the ICS CERT was merged into CISA. He was the longest serving director of the ICS CERT. He sort of, had a lot to do with what the ICS CERT became. They put out a lot of guidance. And I pinned him down at one of the conferences we were at. I said, Marty, most of the guidance you guys are putting out is really basic. It's starting at zero. It's guys, put some passwords on stuff, disconnect from the internet. And I'm going, can you put something out that sort of tells people what the second and third and fourth step are? Where should they be going? Not where are they starting from? And his answer was, Andrew, you guys at Waterfall, you deal with the world's most secure industrial enterprises. You deal with the high end. Your customers are asking, what's the next step? He says, as an agency, we deal with everyone, and 90% of everyone back then, hopefully not today anymore, 90% of everyone is still starting at zero. Over and over, we need to tell them what's the first thing they need to do. So when you're reading a lot of this stuff, don't be surprised if a lot of the advice you see is really, really basic. 62443 says you have to have configurable password strengths. You should have, minimum length and variety of character types in your password. Everyone knows this. I'm sorry. The NERC-CIP says, where technically feasible, close unused services and ports, harden your machines. Yeah, we kind of knew that. The TS8 pipeline directive says you have to have a patch management strategy. Okay, you got to get your patches applied. Everyone says this. The Irish, 9-pager. One example. Don't use. Have different accounts. One for doing dangerous stuff. Reconfiguring your system, and one for just using it. So. And again, the Singapore use multi-factor authentication for remote access. Again, very basic stuff. Nothing wrong with it, but don't be surprised if you run into this, especially if you're looking for something more advanced. For now, most of the guidance out there is going to cover the basics. Some of it, is going to do a little bit more. I think what I will say, I think I say it further on, but before I forget, if you want more advanced advice, don't look at basic guidance. Look at some of the regulations for the most critical infrastructure. There you're going to see something that's a little more advanced because these are high consequence systems. And the regulations are going to demand something better than is needed at a small bakery. Supply chain, another huge buzzword, huge trend in recent months. Some examples. Cybersecurity supply chain risk management is integrated. You have to have it. Basically, then this cybersecurity framework says you have to do supply chain. Yep. The second one, CIE says, have you got agreements in place for your suppliers to alert you if the supplier's systems are compromised? We should be requiring our vendors to have security programs and to report when they've been breached so that we know whether there's a risk that the breach has introduced malware or some other nasty into the products that we source from those vendors. Okay. The Irish says you should have an SBOM, supplier bill of materials. Why? So that you can figure out if any of the stuff your suppliers are using itself has a vulnerability, so that you can, again, figure out how vulnerable you are. Yes, most of us, and the question is, where do we use this? In a small bakery, we might apply all of the security updates as quick as they come available. In a large power plant, we might not. We still might want to be aware of how exposed we are, but we might not apply the patches right away. The fourth one here, the source and provenance of all devices in the OT environment should be known. This is huge. I mean, the American government recently came out with concerns that alleged that Chinese manufacturers of cranes used in ports had inserted surreptitious communications equipment in those cranes that would let the cranes phone home and receive instruction, potentially malicious instruction. We need to understand, do we trust the organizations that create the products, the tools, the software, the hardware that we use in our OT systems? And can we account for everyone who's touched those things between the organization that allegedly produced them and us as consumers? Was there a break in the chain where a counterfeit device might have been inserted? This is a big problem in safety systems, safety instrumented systems. There's you absolutely need this kind of provenance to figure out, am I buying an authentic, expensive, extremely reliable safety instrumented system? Or am I buying a cheap, unreliable system that has all the same labels as the expensive system, but in fact, someone is deceiving me and they're not an authorized seller of this in my geography? So go to the manufacturer, ask who are their authorized sellers, ask for phone numbers of those people, follow the chain from the manufacturer down to you. Okay, don't follow it in the reverse direction. You can be misled. Understand, is what I'm buying the real thing, or has it been tampered with? And, NERC CIP is a little strange. It does not say, pardon me. That's coming in a next slide. NERC demands, this is CIP 013, demands a supply chain security program. It's confusing. Every NERC CIP owner and operator can put their own, risk assessment questionnaires together. For vendors like us, it's a real problem because every questionnaire is different. But yeah, NERC CIP has got a whole document on supply chain. Dependencies. This is sort of more modern, more interesting to me. The textbook case is Maersk Shipping. This was NotPetya in 2017. The NotPetya, the adversary, allegedly the Russians inserted malware into a security update for a tax package. The tax package auto-updated. Hundreds of enterprises went down. Maersk Shipping went down, the world's largest container shipping company, not because the malware got into the ships and ran the ships aground. The ships navigated perfectly safely into port, not because NotPetya got into the cranes that lifted the containers. The cranes worked perfectly. They delicately took the containers off the ports, off the ships, and put them onto the waiting 18-wheeler trucks. Everything stopped because the container tracking system on the IT network was crippled, and we could no longer print waybills for the drivers to say where to take the containers. So everything stopped because of a dependency on IT infrastructure. So the TSA called out these dependencies. If you're going to separate IT and OT, you'd have to understand your dependencies. The Australian says you really should not have OT systems reliant on IT systems if you want OT to survive an IT outage. You shouldn't have these dependencies. Understand them, and if you can, get rid of them. The Singaporean practice says you will inventory your systems, and one of the things you have to do is document the dependencies of your automation systems on any external networks like IT networks. We have to understand them if we want to understand how at risk we are. The CI implementation guide, one of the questions that engineers are encouraged to ask is, what dependencies does the system we're designing have on business, on IT infrastructure, on other external infrastructure? NERC does not use the word dependency. NERC language almost forbids dependencies on IT, but it's done strangely. The legal definition of a cyber asset that's essential to the operation of the bulk electric system is that if that cyber asset, if it's taken down, if it's misused, if it's misconfigured, if that would affect power flowing into the bulk electric system within 15 minutes of compromise, then that asset is in scope for all of the NERC-CIP rules, which means pretty much every owner and operator has figured out, I cannot, I have to be able to operate OT completely independently. If I depend on an IT asset like an Active Directory server, that Active Directory server comes into scope as a NERC-CIP asset, and I have to apply all of the NERC-CIP rules that apply to this class of site, low, medium, or high impact, to that asset. With Active Directory servers, one of the rules is for, high impact sites, you have to, I forget, something like every 18 months, review every account, every one of the 100,000 employee accounts in the Active Directory server to make sure they have only the permissions they need. IT says, thank you, no, get away. So you cannot, in the NERC-CIP world, it just costs too much. And so they've pretty much eliminated all of these dependencies. I'm running a little bit late here, but let's try and blast through this. Network engineering, consequence boundaries. These words, network engineering, consequence boundaries, these are words I made up for my third book, the gold book here. I needed words to talk about this trend. It's a new trend. What does it mean? A consequence boundary is a connection between two networks with dramatically different worst case consequences of compromise. So for example, the TSA example I gave, hard isolation. You got to separate the two networks with the different consequences. Cyber informed engineering says, are your defenses proportionate to the consequence, to the worst case consequence of your networks? Because connections are important. The most common consequence boundary that I observe in this documentation is, for example, the TSA example, the connection between IT and OT networks. That is the most common consequence boundary I see this stuff talking about. The connection between OT and the internet for cloud systems is an emerging space, but that's another example of a consequence boundary. The consequence boundary idea is related to dependencies. Dependencies across consequence boundaries are unwise. But fundamentally, what is network engineering? What am I talking about here? I'm not making a little sense. I missed a step. We remember that the overpressure valve example. The valve engages, the steam escapes, there's no explosion, nobody dies. This is all good. And we shut the power plant down. Why? Because that overpressure relief valve is our last ditch defense. We had 4 levels of digital safety break before the mechanical valve engaged. This should never happen. When that valve engages, 9 times out of 10, the operator lifts the cage on the big red mushroom button, shuts down the plant, because we need to find out what just happened here. How did that happen? Why did that happen? And what are we going to do to make sure this never happens again? We were this close to dying. And by shutting down the plant, we've put national security at risk. What? How did national security come into this? The legal definition of critical infrastructure is critical to the nation. If we shut down a large power plant or a passenger rail switching system, we've put national security at risk. How do we avoid that? We need to avoid the attack propagating through the consequence boundary into, from the lower consequence, less defended system into the higher consequence, more thoroughly defended system. Network engineering is a name I made up for a class of techniques that reliably prevent attacks propagating, attacks pivoting through consequence boundaries into more critical networks. So, The idea that we have different networks at different levels of security, and it's possible for attacks to leak from a lower security network, like an IT network, into a higher security network, like a higher consequence network. At that connection between at the consequence boundary, we need to do something different. So, for example, the, uh, the Singaporean code, the chief information officer shall ensure that the OT system is not connected to any enterprise network except where necessary for operating the OT system, and provided that we're sending information unidirectionally from the OT system to the IT and no information is coming back. Why is that important? All cyber attacks are information. The only way a control system can change from a normal state to a sabotage state is if it, attack information somehow enters the system. And so, whereas on IT networks, information is the asset, we try to protect the information. On OT networks, information is the threat. Information is the way that attacks enter. So again, the requirement is one way out, nothing back. And the last trend I observe is that increasingly, NIST 2 is talking about risk-based, increasingly in lots of different standards bodies and guidance bodies and regulatory bodies, there's discussion of risk. What does risk mean? Fundamentally, risk is boring. Nobody wants to talk about risk. Fundamentally, risk asks the question, how much is enough? How much security? How much engineering? NIST 2 says the regulations shall reflect risk. There will be, stricter regulations for more consequential systems than less. NERC SIP, the risk might be fuzzy in 62443 guidance. It's absolutely baked into the NERC regulations. For example, a medium impact rating for a power plant is if the power plant has, is delivering 1,500 megawatts or more into a single part of the grid in the last 12 months. That makes it a medium impact asset. This is what's called a bright line rule. You must apply the rules for medium impact assets if your facility meets this. And there's the SIP 002 standard, the appendix, the attachment 1 rather to the standard is pages and pages of these systems are medium impact, those systems are high impact, all of the strict criteria. So in regulations, this tends to be very clear. The societal expectations for managing cyber risk are becoming very clear in one regulation after another. What we're seeing is standards and guidance starting to pick up on, well, this is what we have to do for these classes of systems. This is what we have to do for those classes of systems. And they're starting to try and capture that as advice for people not in critical infrastructures to answer the question, how much is enough? Some other examples, CIE says, when you look at risk, start with your most impactful networks. Do not start at zero. Do not address your simplest risks first. Do not address your least consequential, most frequent risks first. Address the big fish first. That's the priority. And, deal with the little fish afterwards as opportunity arises. The ISA, again, has these security levels that are defined in terms of the capability of the adversary, which confuses a lot of people. When people assign security levels, they don't say how capable is my adversary. They say how consequential is my system. And they assign higher security levels based on consequence in practice. When I talk to practitioners, they use consequence to decide the security level, not trying to interpret how capable is my adversary. And finally, in the remote access, again, the latest advice is saying on the OT side, for high consequence OT systems, your boundaries between networks should be unidirectional, hardware enforced one way. Nothing can get back. into your high consequence systems. If you're going to use remote access, it has to be hardware enforced unidirectional remote access. This is the best advice out there. That's what I had for you. A word real quick about Waterfall, and then I'm going to come into predictions. Waterfall we invented the unidirectional gateway. We're the unidirectional gateway company. We serve heavy industry, critical industrial infrastructure, the high end of building automation, data centers, all over the world. We are trusted by critical industrial infrastructure all over the world. I'm on LinkedIn. Reach out to me if you have questions, if you'd like to get better connected to the leader in OT cybersecurity. That's us. I promised you some predictions. I have only a few minutes left before the top of the hour. We might have to go a little bit late, but expect more regulations, more standards, more guidance. Why? Because the threat environment is getting worse. The bad guys are getting better at what they do. Waterfall does an annual threat report. The threat report is going like this in terms of incidents with physical consequences. As the threat environment worsens, and it's worsening steadily, exponentially, if our numbers hold for the next few years. And so everyone out there, all of the authorities are going to put more stuff out. Expect basic hygiene to be a focus of a lot of guidance, telling people start at zero. If you're already past zero, you're going to have to pick and choose your guidance. There's going to be a lot of basic hygiene that you have to page through because, you've done that already. For inspiration, if you're looking for how can I set some goals for my cybersecurity program in the years ahead that are better than basic hygiene, look to regulations for critical infrastructure. Look to the Singaporean regulations, cross-industry, very readable. Look to NERC CIP, but bear in mind the limitations. They don't say a word about safety. Bear in mind the limitations. Look to these regulations, and you will get, you will have sort of the minimal societal expectations for high consequence systems spelled out. That's a clue as to where you might want to evolve your system over time as the threat environment gets worse. CIE, I predict, is going to change the landscape. It's not clear how this way of looking at the problem. When I explain CIE, and I talk about CIE in my new book. Free copies are still available at the URL there. You don't have to go out to Amazon and buy a copy. You can request a free copy from Waterfall. Please leave 6 to 8 weeks for delivery. When I explain CIE and sort of the engineering perspective on risk and how it's changing how we look at cyber threats, the most common reaction I get is, "What a good idea! Why is this new? This shouldn't be new. This should be this should have been the way we were looking at the problem for the last 20 years." But it isn't. It is new. And it's new to most of us. There's always exceptions. Some people have been doing this stuff from the beginning. This is where the Idaho National Laboratory is drawing their inspiration for the body of knowledge. They're not making this stuff up. They're talking to people who've been doing this for years, doing it right, and telling everyone else who's going, "Oh, look at that. What a good idea." So we're not sure how it's going to change the landscape, but half of CIE is engineering. It's not cybersecurity. Are we ever going to see engineering reflected in cybersecurity standards? I don't know, but this is a question a lot of people are asking right now. So expect change. I don't know how yet. Consequence boundaries. This is an idea whose time has come. This is everyone I've talked to. This is chapter 5 in the new book, talking about consequence boundaries and lots of different ways to do network engineering to prevent the propagation of attacks reliably. Think about it. So close enough. Get the book. Unidirectional is the most common example of network engineering, but the chapter 5 has, I don't know, a half dozen or more examples of ways to reliably prevent the propagation of cyber attacks. Hardware enforced unidirectionally, as I said, most common example of network engineering, and is increasingly demanded by regulators for the most consequential industrial sites. This is something that should be on everybody's radar in terms of where cybersecurity is going over the years. Something I have not mentioned, because it's not there in any of the standards. But in the last couple of, like in the last 6 weeks, um, I have a speaking topic coming up at S4 in Tampa in February. The title is, credibility, not likelihood, talking about when we look at high consequence risk assessment, the word likelihood, the concept of likelihood is leading us astray. And I proposed this. I'm a member of the 62443-3-2 risk assessment committee that's working on revising that standard. I proposed this to them, vigorous debate, and got another half dozen invitations from other standards bodies who'd heard about this idea, and every one of them I've presented to and are looking at the question. Instead of asking how likely is this attack that's never happened, we should ask, how credible is the attack? How credible is the threat? Is it reasonable to believe that this attack will ever come after us? If I operate a small water system in the middle of nowhere, is it reasonable that the Russians would buy 3 sleepers, 3 cybersecurity gurus, a sleeper spy cell, sit on them for 5 years until they trigger that cell to carry out a catastrophic cyber attack on the small agricultural community's drinking water system? Well, the Russians have the ability to do that. Is it credible? Is it reasonable to believe they would do that? I don't think so. Is it reasonable to believe they might do that for, the water system in the city of Washington, D.C.? That is, in fact, a credible threat. So this is something not, that I put out there. I promised you predictions. Given the degree of interest that I've seen in the topic so far, I suggest that this is language, or this is an evolution of risk-based language. Answering the question, how much is enough? Evaluating what risk is left over. How much of that residual risk really should I bring back into scope for my security program? These are all decisions that are sort of spelled out, these are the rules are spelled out in critical infrastructure. You must do this, you must do that. But for everyone else, how do we decide this is an open question, and one that increasingly standards and guidance bodies are interested in documenting a decision process much more clearly than we currently document it. So there's a prediction for you, is that you'll see this word increasingly in the years ahead. This is all important. When we look to evaluate risk, when we look to evaluate, answer the question, how much is enough? Here's the thing. When engineers design a bridge, we as the public expect that bridge to carry a specified load in a specified operating environment for a specified number of decades with a large margin for error. This is the expectation. Increasingly, when we look at these standards, when we look at regulations, the public expects engineering teams who design automation for safety critical, for national, critical, for critical infrastructure, expect that automation to carry a specified threat load until at least the next opportunity to upgrade our security system. And we all know these opportunities come at long intervals. Carry a specified threat load until the next opportunity to upgrade our system with a large margin for error. And so this is why I suggest look at the high end of critical infrastructure. Look at the book I wrote on the high end of decision making, and chart out how we're going to get to carry a specified threat load in an environment where the threat is increasing, until the next opportunity to upgrade with a large margin for error. I suggest that's our goal looking at these standards. We need to chart a path in our security program to get to that goal. I'm behind schedule. My apologies. Natalia, do we have some questions here? Well, I think, we have a recording of this going on. Everyone's going to get the recording. If you have to fade out, you have to fade out. But you'll be able to follow the question and answer in the recording.
Well, first of all, thank you for a great presentation, like always. Yes, we have a lot of questions, and unfortunately, we're running out of time. Let's maybe take a couple of questions. And
Okay, and
just,
I
yeah.
will try and get back to anyone who's asked a question with an answer in email. I'm behind on that. I was supposed to do that for my previous webinar 3 weeks ago on remote access. My apologies to anyone who asked a question on that webinar. I am going to get back to you, but it might take me a while. I'm back in my home office. I'm not on the road anymore, so hopefully within a week or two, I'll be able to get to all of these questions. So, but what have you got for us? You know, give us a couple of challenging ones, a couple of interesting ones.
Okay, what has been your experience in converging IT and OT to the governance, compliance, and cybersecurity table?
Converging, you know, IT and OT governance is challenging. And again, I am a huge fan of the approach that cyber-informed engineering suggests for that. Um, First off, what we need to understand is the difference. Okay. On IT networks, information is the asset. On OT networks, sometimes the information, you know, the programs for our robots in large manufacturing facilities, some of the information is an asset and needs to be protected. On IT, information is the asset and needs to be protected. But, you know, in OT, we also have a physical asset, and information is the threat to the correct operation of the physical asset. All cyber sabotage is information. All information flows can carry attack information. I can prove this mathematically. And so we have to understand that there are these deep differences as well as similarities. And again, cyber-informed engineering says, look, if we make the engineering teams aware of how much trouble they're in, teach them about modern attacks, and their eyes open up, in my experience, and go, that's not good. You've got that covered, right? IT, you've solved that problem. And now teach them about the tools that IT has deployed to address cyber threats to information. You know, how to break antivirus, what are the limitations of each of these tools? And now they're going, we're in trouble, and these tools don't cover as much of the threat as we thought they did. We need to fix this. When engineering teams come to the table saying, we need to fix this, that's when we see progress. Similarly, when IT teams come to the table and understand that you cannot patch everything. If you patch everything, you risk killing people. You know, if an IT team says patch everything, put antivirus everywhere, what's wrong with you? The correct answer from engineering is, how likely is that to kill anyone? What? What do you mean kill anyone? IT teams need to become aware of the limitations on OT, of the expectations for protecting public safety, for protecting worker safety, for assuring reliable operation of critical infrastructures. Once these teams become aware of each other's limitations, now they can come together and say, we need to solve this problem. They're not going to come up with one rule to rule them all. They're going to come up bluntly with different approaches for the different domains for high consequence systems. All of that, if you apply it to a small bakery, a small shoe factory, you know, the IT approach might be exactly what you need in the small shoe factory, because there's no consequence boundary, because there's electromechanical safeties protecting worker safety, because if the factory goes down for 2 weeks, you know, we get insurance to pay us out. It's all good. So for the most consequential systems, we need mutual understanding so that people come to the table demanding a solution that works and inventing a solution that works. For the least consequential systems, yeah, I'm sorry. In my books, IT approaches should work all the way through. Controversial, sorry, that's what I document in my third book.
Thank you, Ginter. Next question. What would be your big picture on TSA NORP for pipeline industry versus TSA SDS from security requirements perspective?
I actually have a blog post out on this. Reading the NOPR is it was, for me, was really hard. there's a lot of legal language in there. The tail end of the notice of proposed rulemaking is technical language, and it reads a lot like the the security directives. Uh, you have to have governance to be able to separate IT and OT. You have to check, understand your dependencies, blah, blah, blah. The technical requirements seem very similar, but I got so confused by the legal language, I couldn't really tell. And so I've actually had a volunteer. I've got a call scheduled with this person coming up. Um, Volunteer to help me understand the legal language. So they seem very similar. I haven't found material differences. Um, the difference that the NOPR documents is, yeah, they've proposed a bunch of changes to separate physical security rules like terrorism from cybersecurity rules. They were sort of all mashed together. So there's a lot of legal language separating these rules out, but I don't know that they're changing the rules any. I couldn't figure this out. There's rules for, I don't know, um, rationalizing how security directives will be issued in the future because there was a different procedure for every domain, different one for pipelines, a different one for rails. So there was a bunch of legal language rationalizing that. I think the technical, requirements are similar, but it's all clouded. Once I figure out how to read the wretched thing, hopefully I will with the volunteers who's going to teach me this. I've promised to write a blog post explaining to other people what I learned and how to read these documents.
Thank you. Our next question about artificial intelligence, of course. Are you starting to see artificial intelligence tools and applications entering into the OT environment? And if yes, is AI transformation a good IT-OT collaboration topic to get them to the same table?
I have not found AI to be a useful collaboration topic. The most useful topic I've heard for in terms of collaboration is risk, physical risk of killing people, cyber threats of coming in and messing your systems up so badly that you kill people. Risk, threat is what brings people to the table. AI, I don't see as something that brings people to the table. I have seen used a lot in cybersecurity tools forever. People have been doing an anomaly detection is AI. It's machine learning. Learn what's normal, raise an alarm on something abnormal. Um, AI is increasingly used in security information and event management systems. Again, to look at correlations between millions of log events that come in every day and say, there's something suspicious going on over here. You should investigate that. So AI is used on the defensive side. It's used on the offensive side. It's being used increasingly. Large language models are being used to craft very convincing phishing emails. In terms of AI in operations, increasingly, I see safety critical decisions being made by AIs. And some of chapter 5 it suggests tools and techniques that can be used to deal with some of that, especially when the AI is out in the cloud. But frankly, this is the topic of my next book. I've recently decided I do have another book in me, and it's going to be about the future of industrial automation, especially in the realms of safety, security, cloud, and AI, all mixed together. I want to do a survey of architectures of network engineering techniques. How can we rationalize these, 4 or 5 apparently, things that today engineering teams go, you just used 5 of those words in the same sentence. They don't fit in the same sentence. These are completely different animals. They're not. Increasingly, they're merging. So that's what I hope to be studying for the next 12 months, and hopefully, writing something about learning from people like the people on the call right now. I learn from you folks. I'm keen to learn from you folks. Most of what I do is I document what I've learned from you folks and occasionally make up terminology. whenever I make up sort of my own security techniques, they don't work. Have a look at chapter 6. Look at the formula in there. You'll see problems. I made up that formula. That was a mistake. Going forward, I'm going to report what you guys do and not try and make stuff up on my own. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Well, unfortunately, we are completely out of time. I think we should take the rest of the questions offline and answer it via email. Any last words?
Thank you so much, Natalia. Thank you to everyone who attended. Do reach out to me on LinkedIn. Grab a free copy of the book. Again, I'm always looking for feedback. What do you think about the material? I learn from the feedback, and I look forward to interacting with you, hopefully at events like S4 coming up. I mentioned there's a new event in the world, Level 0, coming up, focused on the engineering perspective on cybersecurity. So look for that event. Look for a strong cyber-informed engineering perspective at that event. I hope to run into you folks and have conversations about this stuff. Learn about the hardest stuff you're doing and how you do it, so that I can write about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And on behalf of Waterfall, we'd like to thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.